Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Serwer, and welcome to At Barrons. And also welcome to our guest, Jim Hagedorn, CEO of the Scott's Miracle-Gro Company. Jim, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So I think everyone knows about your company, and you've got kind of a really interesting long story, an interesting short story. But remind us about the core products that your company offers.
If you garden, you're probably using our products. So Miracle-Gro, Scott's, Ortho, Roundup, those are our sort of big brands in lawn and garden. And so, those are the products that pretty much, so it's a lawn and garden company and big time in gardening especially.
And so what's that business like? I mean, you would do like 3 to 4 billion in sales, and are there different competitors who have products that you go up against, and do you distribute?
Not really.
Right, yeah. Well, okay, you distribute
First of all, what kind of business? It's a great business to be in. So, if you had to have a consumer goods company in a certain category, like right now, we're the biggest vendor in like Home Depot right now in the entire store. So 25% of the business of the big DIY centers, Lowe's and Depot, is lawn and garden. And we are King Kong in lawn and garden. So, and if you got to be in a business, how about being a business that people really enjoy and are passionate about, and they're doing it outside and it's beauty and all that. So start with, we're in a great business that people love to do and are passionate about it. And it represents a giant part of do-it-yourself retail.
I mentioned the short story part about people loving to do it. It has to do with the pandemic. And you were a very hot stock in the pandemic. I take it because people were at home, they stared out, they had nothing to do, and they got to go to their lawns, and the stock soared to over $220. It's now back down to 57. It went all the way up, all the way down. Tell us about that.
It sucked, dude. That journey is terrible.
Well, the up part must have been okay.
It was okay. I think it was okay, but I don't look at the stock price a lot, because I think when it's low, you think you're an idiot, and when it's high, you think you're a genius. And I think we're probably not any of the two. We're somewhere in the middle. When COVID started, we were really scared because we didn't know what was going to happen. Remember, there was like essential businesses. Remember like the talk back then? And we figured, is lawn and garden essential? I mean, in our heads it was, but we weren't sure that politicians would say so. But it turned out it was deemed an essential business. And I think that's because people needed. 2 states said we were not essential and you couldn't shop.
What
Vermont and Michigan, which they took so much crap from citizens that like 2 weeks later they had to say they're essential. And by the way, smoking pot, which is the other part of our business that became extremely valuable back then, that was also deemed essential. So gardening and smoking pot were deemed essential. And I think that, yeah, of course, people were home. They had nothing to do except spend time in their garden. But we didn't know that. I think it says something really great about lawn and garden is that when people are stuck at home and scared, and you remember what this is like. We thought everybody was going to die back then. What did people do when they were afraid and they couldn't socialize? They gardened. And I think that says something really great about the sort of business we're in. And that's what I love about it so much.
Leaving aside the pandemic, though, Jim, how cyclical is the business? Does it track the economy when times are good?
Not really. Not really. Which is a healthy thing. I mean, if you look and say, kind of what have we done wrong to the business by, I think, bringing pot in, which we had really high hopes for, is the business wasn't very cyclical. As the economy went up and down, people liked the garden. And the more people don't travel, the more people stay at home and they don't go out to restaurants, they want a garden. It's a little bit like, what do they do when they're scared that the country's going to die? They wanted the garden and beautify their home. And so what we find is that the business does not move so much with the economy. And that's healthy. A lot of investors really like that about our business, which is, you're a good stock, I don't have to pay attention that much. And we're much more sensitive to weather than we are the economy.
And you mentioned the pot business, the weed business, some people call it. What went wrong? And I understand you're looking to spin that off now, right?
Not really.
No? That's the
what went wrong? There are 2 questions.
Right.
Look, I think the government completely screwed the pooch on this. I think how we got into it was a Wall Street Journal. A couple of reporter ladies came to visit me on Long Island. This is more than 10 years ago, and said, pot, lawn and garden? And I said, it's a plant, needs food and soil and all that. Why wouldn't it be? And so I made some trips out to the West Coast, and you started to see California, Colorado really developing. And a lot of those, remember, we're not selling pot, we sell supplies to grow pot. So, fertilizer, soils, just what we do in lawn and garden. And more of the shelf space was going to this new business, which nobody would, because they thought everybody was a DA agent. They basically say, no, I'd say, dude, it's all pot, right? And these would be shopkeepers, and they'd say, no, tomatoes, green tomatoes, because they just were nervous about it. But the business started to get more and more shelf space, and it started to look as big as lawn and garden, and we weren't in it. So I went back to my board, and I said, look, I think we should do this cultivation supply stuff. And they're like, no. They read it in the Wall Street Journal and said, no, Jim, we're not doing that. And I just kept on it for a couple of years. I mean, if you look at the business today, I mean, this is what is so screwed up about it. More people smoke pot today than drink alcohol. And this, I'm not making this up. This is real data. It's bigger than the craft beer industry, is pot. And I think we decided that the board wanted to know it was legal. Me and my management team were willing to take some risk on this area. And we figured we'll be an early entrant, and that the feds, as these states legalized, that the feds within 3 to 5 years, this is like 10 years ago, 3 to 5 years, they would make the laws so that it was not federally a Schedule I narcotic. And, we had a lot of faith. We had a lot of faith in Democrats would do it, who said we should make this a non-Schedule I narcotic. And it's never happened. And between the states and the feds, because it's a Schedule I narcotic, you cannot deduct your business expenses. So your top line revenue is your taxable income. So you're paying about an 80% tax rate. Think about that. Then you throw the states on and local stuff and all the extra stuff you have to do because it's highly restricted. You cannot make money. And back in the early days, people were willing to put risk capital in.
Right. I get it.
Figuring they would legalize it, and the tax rate would go down to 20%. But it hasn't happened yet. And now all money's gone. There's no capital available in the space. Nobody in the space can make money. And it's legal in 75% of where people live.
And so what are you going to do with that business? So you're not spinning it off, or you're going to keep it?
We're going to spin it off, but we're going to spin it off so we can get it back.
What does that mean? How's that going to work?
We're going to put it in friendly hands. We'll sell it for paper. We'll have the right to buy it back. Today, our banks aren't that happy with us owning it because we have some plant touching assets that we have through a Canadian sub. And so a lot of our banks now are like, dude, I don't know. Even though it's a Canadian company, it's legal there, we don't think you guys should own it. And I think that our business is suffering as well. This is a business that made, go back 3 years ago, it was earning 150 plus million per year. It was probably worth, in our equity, more than $5 billion. Today it's worth, if I'm being generous, 0 in our equity. So it's probably a negative number in our equity. And I think the lawn and garden business that people said, dude, it is such a good business for us. It's high cash flow. It's not very sensitive to the environment or the economy. And so why don't you just move it over to someplace else? Why don't you they want to get rid of it. The problem is we've invested about $2 billion in that space, and I don't want to burn it. I think that we can save that business, but it's not a great place for us to be in our SMG public equity.
But you don't hear anything from the Trump administration about federal legalization, do you?
Oh, of course we do.
Okay.
Definitely. I have spoken to President Trump a couple times about this. I'm a supporter of his. And I think he is in favor of rescheduling, which would solve it's 280E, the IRS code. It would solve the 280E issue. It would help us with banking issues. So the two issues that are really hobbling that business is nobody can make money because of the tax rate, and you can't bank at any normal bank.
Right. Well, I guess I haven't heard about it, but there's been a lot going on, so maybe we'll get to it soon.
Yeah, I hope so.
Right.
The empty promises from politicians to fixing this. If you look and say, when did the equities in pot companies, were they at a peak? When Biden got elected and you had a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House, everybody said this will get fixed finally, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, no, I remember the weed ETF and all those investments. So you've done a bunch of acquisitions, Jim, over the years, and you've got, a fair amount of debt on the company. Talk to us about that and what you're doing to address the leverage.
Well, we've already done a lot. So it wasn't just the failure in the pot space that got our leverage up. It was, as we were coming out of COVID, we never had enough product. So, we had a consumer business that was probably growing on average 2% per year. During COVID, plus 35%. We didn't have manufacturing that could handle that. We didn't have supply chain. We didn't have raw materials. We didn't have finished goods. So the third year of COVID, as COVID was coming out, we said, we're going to have product. So we had a lot of raw materials. We had a lot of inventory. We had dozens of new distribution facilities, new manufacturing. And then COVID ended and pot didn't perform. So that business went from plus, call it 150 in 1 year to minus 50. Okay, it was not a fabulous lawn and garden year, but I spent like $2 billion buying pot supply stuff, legally for the pot side for Hawthorne. That plus Hawthorne not making their numbers, plus I probably had $1.5 billion in inventory and facilities that I just didn't need at this point as COVID came off and growth rates came back down. So that really drove the leverage issue. So we've cut $400 million of expenses out of the business. We've reinvested about $100 million back into it. We're making excellent progress, taking even more money out. So, I would say 2 years we'll be back at kind of a normal leverage, which is, I think, below where we were always pretty happy at sort of 3.5 times leverage. That's a pretty good spot for us where we're high yield, but we're getting like investment grade rates because people like our company. But we've kind of screwed up the beta in our company, so people view us as less reliable. It was a very hard couple of years as we got through this.
Yeah, I want to shift gears and ask you about the long story that I mentioned, because the company's got this incredible backstory. You've got Scotts is 157 years old. Miracle-Gro is a family business. Your dad started that, and then they mushed them together. And I don't know, what year was that, 95 or something? And then you went public. I think Scotts was owned by ITT. All this incredible stuff. Tell us about all that.
Scotts did get bought by ITT. They screwed it up, sold it to Clayton Dubilier. My family company on Long Island was Miracle-Gro.
Your dad invented it?
My dad was really the advertising behind it. He and the guy that invented it got together. My father bought that guy out. And my father was an incredible guy who loved consumer products. This whole Procter idea of like toilet paper or toothpaste, which is flush it down the toilet, spit it down the sink, buy it every day. And so he wanted, and I think that was his dream, is to have a consumer product like that, was consumable, throw it on the ground, people will buy it every year. And so he got that, and that business, like when we did our deal with Scotts, business was about $100 million in sales. And
the Miracle-Gro side.
Miracle-Gro. Completely virtual, meaning we advertised it and we counted the money. That was what we did. We outsourced the sales work. We outsourced manufacturing. We were a sub-S company, so we didn't pay corporate tax. At this point, it was after my mom died and the kids ended up with most of the business. So we owned, the 6 kids owned this business that was, at a like 20% income tax rate, earning $40 million a year on $100 million in sales. And Scotts, Clayton Dubilier went public with Scotts on the NASDAQ. It didn't perform at all. And Sam Johnson from SEJ had come out to visit my dad and said, I'll buy Miracle-Gro for $400 million. And I'm looking at Scotts equity. This is back on AOL on a telephone modem. Beep, beep, you have mail. And market cap of Scotts was like $265 million. They just didn't make a single quarter. So I said, Miracle-Gro is worth more than Scotts. So we decided to make an offer to see if we could merge the companies. We wouldn't take any money. We would just take equity in the company. And we, I think, took like 40% of Scotts. And nobody ever said no. And, my older brother said, Jim, what are you trying to do here? Because it was my deal. I said, I want to have the Procter & Gamble of lawn and garden. And he said, what does that mean? And I said, everything of value in lawn and garden, I want. And I think, remember when you put Scotts and Miracle-Gro together, you had both of the fertilizer, the big brands, and grow. I'd call it the grow side of the business, as opposed to the kill side of the business. With Ortho and Roundup, we brought in the big brands on kill. So what you have then is the big brands on both the grow side and the control side of lawn and garden. And that, while we were doing that, back in those days, Kmart and like TrueServe were the only real nationwide distributors of lawn and garden products. Walmart was not national, Home Depot was not national, Lowe's was not national. So right when we were consolidating lawn and garden, retail was consolidating, and we just became this important vendor where today, probably 90% of lawn and garden is sold in 5 different retailers.
Right.
And so these consolidations occurred at the same time. And how do we stay powerful? Because we do the advertising, we bring consumers in the store, we deliver to the stores every week, we merchandise the product to the retailers, we sell it for the retailers because there's very few people in these departments now. That's how Scotts has become as important as it is.
What are some tips for people this summer who are looking to maintain a healthy lawn?
Oh, it's easy. I mean, we have a 4-step program. So, if
besides using your products, I mean, sure.
Well, I mean, I think within the law, depending on where you live, water and try to get like an inch a week on your lawn. So use a sprinkler, or if you get enough rain to do that, apply a fertilizer. If you apply a fertilizer, you're going to have much less need for weed killers or anything else. A good, healthy lawn. But 4 fertilizer treatments per year is really, you will have a great yard. So if all you have to do is put fertilizer down and water your lawn, and you're going to have a great lawn.
And I wanted to ask you about lawns and gardens, and what do they mean to Americans? This is kind of a heavy question. I mean, why do people care? I mean, you have these lawns. How did it get that way? And why do people care? Why don't we just have like wild plants growing in our yards? What do you think it means to people?
Dude,
right?
I have this conversation all the time. First,
really?
My chief garden officer and my friend.
That's a CGO?
Is Martha Stewart. And that's I'm not making that up.
That's right.
Martha is our chief gardening officer. And I was with Martha last week. And I want to try to take our commercials from selling a product to selling, let's garden this year. And this gets back to exactly what you're asking. What does it mean? And, let's start with what Martha is, because it's home, woman, mother, cook, gardener. I mean, you think about all the stuff that Martha really stands for. And, if you ask Martha, when you get like all upset and, she can get grumpy, where are you going to find her? In the garden. And I think, they've asked like women in their 50s, would you rather be intimate with your husband or garden? And they say, I'd rather garden. So what does it mean? I think people have a real need to have their hands in the soil and cultivate. And I think it's a human need, a psychological need to nurture something and create some beauty. And you could be in an apartment in New York, or you could be at a suburban home on Long Island. I think you go to somebody's house that's got a nice garden and people care about it, or if they have edibles and they say, yeah, these tomatoes are I grew them myself. I think you say, damn, this is nice. And there's always neighbors. If you live in the suburbs, there's people who don't care. And you look at those lawns and you think there's some crazy person living there. I think you drive by a nice lawn. I don't care what your political beliefs are. Mm-hmm. I think you say, that's a nice lawn. That's what I want. So I think because it's beautiful and it's a place to be with your kids and your pets and makes your home look better. When kids today, we became convinced that kids today wouldn't want to live in a home with a yard and all this. I don't know why. We thought they'd want to live on like the Line Expressway and get in their car and drive to work, and they pay money to an association and they'll mow the lawn and all this stuff. Turns out that's not what people want at all. Mm-hmm. Young people today, I mean, it's hard to get because it's expensive and interest rates are high. But what do they want when they have a kid? They want a dog. They want a yard. They want a garden even more than their parents did. That's what we know. So it's a pretty great industry to be in.
And final question, Jim. You were in the Air Force,
I was.
F-16 pilot. What does being an F-16 pilot have to do with running a lawn care and gardening business? Are there any things that you tie those together?
When I graduated from college, I was already in the Air Force, and I had a year between pilot training. I really didn't know what my dad did. You know, I didn't know what running Miracle-Gro was like. He was kind of a fat guy and, you know, was on the telephone a lot. It didn't seem attractive at all to me. Like being a fighter pilot seemed like a much cooler thing. I was supposed to have a year between graduation and starting pilot training, and it turned into 6 months, but I worked with my dad for 6 months. And what did I realize? Commercial business is combat. You know, just territory is market share. And the rules are pretty loose. You know, the antitrust laws of the United States are I mean, they're there. But if Google and Amazon can get away with stuff, just think about us. You got to be willful to violate the antitrust laws of the United States. And so you have a lot of flexibility to compete, okay? And so the idea of competition and winning and taking market share and the pay is a lot better, you know, is running your own business than it is being in the Air Force. So the Air Force is really fun, and it was a fabulous job. You get out of college and somebody in your 20s and throws you the keys to an F-16. Back in like the Cold War when there was just, Reagan was turning everything around, so it was a little bit like Trump, just spend as much money. So we had so much money to fight back then. And so it was a fabulous job. But, you know, I did it for almost 10 years. And then I told my dad, what do you think? And he said, come join me, dude. And that's how I got into it. So I think it's all combat. It's just, it's less risky and the pay's way better.
Jim Hagedorn, CEO of Scott's Miracle-Gro. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
This is at Barron's. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll catch you next time.